Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the St. Gertrudis double fermentation wash processed Ecuador from Standout Coffee. There's the container right there. And Standout, based out of Stockholm, Sweden. And once again, they were a suggestion to us by Oh Boy, Oh Boy, Oh Boy. So, for the final time in this series, a shout out to and thank you to Oh Boy, Oh Boy, Oh Boy for the suggestion. This is the third and final coffee that we're going to be discussing from the Standout order we placed back in October. And the main reason for picking this coffee is because it is a Sidra coffee. And for all the attention that we've paid to the Mejorado over the last year, the Sidra variety is also very popular in Ecuador. So it felt like a great opportunity to break the trend of reviewing Ecuadorian Mejorado coffees by reviewing an Ecuadorian Sidra coffee. So we'll see how this one turned out. This right here is day 68. And once again, the quick disclaimer on this coffee is that we've actually been sitting on this review for about a month. But let's go ahead and go through our recipe, which once again is our standard recipe in a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also preferred this one through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, while it is along the lines of the other coffees that we've discussed from Standout recently, which is to say that it does feel a little bit more developed than we might have expected going into these reviews. This one actually did feel like the lightest of the three coffees that we are reviewing from them. Even then, I feel like most people would closely align this with the more developed side of a medium light in terms of that roast profile. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 20, first impression, and we did opt for the V60 with our standard recipe. And honestly, that is why I settled on that being our preferred recipe, is because of this day. This was my favorite day of this coffee, as it offered an abundance of citric aspects, skewing ever so slightly on the fermenty orange side of things with an interesting caramel at the forefront, but a nice layer of sweetness, with the cup still offering an above average level of clarity all around. So this was a pretty solid start, and truth be told, it was the best experience I had had from it. As we went back on day 23 with the Chemex, and there were so many more fermenty aspects of this coffee, at least from this point and going forward, as it offered a notable caramel sweetness in the finish, though there was a very strong fermenty and grainy quality to it. Very high levels of citrus as well, which is something I typically experience with the Sidra variety, and it's one of the main reasons I'm not quite as big of a fan of the Sidra variety. It wasn't as impressive as the first try, so we would continue on to day 26 as we opted for the April brewer. And on this day, it was much more reminiscent of the first experience. However, it was a little bit better in the sense that it offered a nice level of sweetness and clarity, as well as structure right at the forefront of the cup, though it does finish with more of that grainy quality, which was, again, a sticking point for me. Right off the top, it feels like an articulated citrus in line with the listed tangerine, with a slight fermented stone fruit aspect and what I would describe as a pancake finish. So the first day and this day were both interesting days, but we would continue on to day 29 with Standout's recipe on the V60, and the cup was skewing pretty heavily in the fermenty sense, with it offering both a fermentiness as well as a grainy quality, very high in the citrus, yet again with little clarity and a long-lasting fermenty finish, so not overly ideal in that regard. Day 33 through the Chemex with Standout's recipe, and it's a bit improved as it's offering a little bit more clarity with a number of citric forward aspects to it, a slightly sweeter sense, lingering fermenting mango once again with a slight citric quality, but not enough to derail the cup. Very long-lasting finish, and there's a very caramelized sweetness to this cup. And the reason I highlight that very long-lasting finish is something that will be demonstrated in this tasting wheel, but this coffee just seems to have a very just eternal finish to it, which is very surprising given what this coffee has. Day 37, back through the V60 with Standout's recipe, and not much of a change as the majority of the cup continues to screw in the grainy, fermenty, citric direction. Not particularly clean, with a long-lasting fermenty dark fruit to complement the strong citrus. A bit of strong caramel again in the finish, and with all of that, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, which is the finish. And that's what I was pointing at, was that the finish of this coffee just seems to go on for a very long time, and it goes on in the direction of a couple of things that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of. The best part of the finish is that it does have a little bit of that candied brown candy sweetness to it, but outside of that, the citrus just seems to last so long, and the fermentiness and graininess of it just seems to linger on your palate for an extended period of time, enough to the point where I was making this tasting wheel and said, man, I took one sip of this coffee, and as I'm charting it, I can still taste this coffee, so I can continue to chart this coffee pretty easily. Level 5 actually does seem appropriate for this coffee. Then we have a handful of level 4s. We'll start with the sweetness level 4. So yeah, even with all of these things, it was a sweeter coffee in general, and that seems to be the trend with the coffees that we're discussing from them, is that they do tend to be on the slightly more sweet side of things, which typically is good for me, but in order to really make me enjoy that level 4 for sweetness, you have to at least get level 4 for clarity, and that's not something that was experienced with this one. So the sweetness is fine, not ideal for me once again. Citrus fruit, level 4, and even with it at times being a very defined citric quality to it, at times you could say tangerine, at times you could say lemon, but for the most part a kind of grainy lemon quality to it. The citrus really seems to dominate this cup, and being there at that level 4 mark, I don't necessarily think it's representative or does justice for how much I was experiencing it at certain times, as I could have definitely justified a level 5 on other times. But for the most part, I feel like I've had much more citric forward coffees, so keeping it toned down, level 4 felt like the best place to put it. Stone fruit, level 4. And unfortunately for me, it was a little bit more of a fermenty, sugary stone fruit, so it was a little bit more of a fermenty mango-like aspect to it. And with it being there at that level 4, oftentimes I find that to be a very good place to chart the coffee, but if it's not offering that clarity, once again, it's not necessarily going to be an overly enjoyable experience. And that's what you always must keep in mind and in context for these tasting wheels, is if the clarity reaches a level 4, I'm going to enjoy all of the rest of the factors in this coffee more. It basically gives them another point. Same thing with it reaching a level 5. That's when I really seem to enjoy a lot of the other qualities much, much more. But this one right here, given the clarity is at that level 3, not overly ideal for me. Caramel, level 4. And once again, I'm really surprised at how much of that candied sweetness is present in all of the coffees we've discussed from them. There's been some sort of candied sweetness, even the Halo Burriti, which had a toffee-like attribute. This one right here has a caramelized attribute. Plenty of brown candy in quite a few of their coffees. So once again, an interesting note for that. Then we have a bunch of level 3s. We will try to speed run through those. Acidity level 3. For all of the citric qualities in this one, I could have fully expected this to be a lot more bright than it was. But making this tasting wheel alongside some of their other coffees, I said it's actually not that bright. And that partially could have been with the lower extraction recipe that we went with for Standout's recipe. But even then, not necessarily the most acidic coffee. Florality, level 3, a little bit more of a generic citric floral quality to it, and not too much to add to that. And then I think the two final things we're discussing is the body at that level 3. Once again, a little bit more texture than I might have expected. V60 could have played a role in it, but it had kind of equal body to that Halo Burriti, at least pretty close in general. And then the cleanliness at a level 3. And I'll be completely honest, I was probably a little generous in terms of the clarity, as if I was being a huge stickler, I could bump that all the way down to a level 2, because I did seem to struggle with two really big qualities, and that was that grainy quality that was ever persistent and pronounced so often in this coffee, but then the fermentiness that was felt in multiple directions, the stone fruits, the citric quality, and just a general heaviness to the cup in general. However, I did opt for the level 3 because I said, there's enough definition to this cup at times, at least in terms of the candied sweetness, so I'll be a little bit more generous and keep it at that level 3. But going through this tasting wheel, I do think this is actually a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I do have to state before I want to add anything else to this one, and it's that I've never necessarily enjoyed the Sidra as much as I've enjoyed a lot of other varieties out there. And that continues to be the theme with this, is that variety just seems to skew a little bit more in the citric direction, given I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of citric quality coffees to begin with. It shouldn't be too much of a surprise that I haven't necessarily had the best results with that variety. Even then, I went into this coffee fully expecting it to be a much cleaner coffee than it actually was, given that it did have the term washed in the processing method, but it didn't necessarily act that way, and as a result, it's not a surprise that I wasn't the biggest fan of this coffee in either of those regards. Being completely honest, of the three coffees that we are discussing from Standout, this one was my least favorite, and it's mostly because it didn't hit on the marks that I really wanted it to. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, though, is anybody that has enjoyed this variety in the past, because I do know there are a lot of people that specifically enjoy it, mostly because it does offer those kind of unique citric qualities. As this one definitely had that. It had it in a very long lasting finish, and those are the two things that I must start pointing towards when it comes to this coffee, because those two things are very prominent, pronounced, and long lasting within the cup. In addition to that, some really nice sweetness as well, and a stone fruit aspect. But the best part for me actually, was going to be the brown candy caramelized sweetness within this cup. So combine all of those factors, best direction I can point somebody towards for this one as well, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the St. Gertrudis double fermentation wash processed Ecuador from Standout Coffee. Thank you for watching.